Hi, welcome to Ashbrook Live. There's a lot going on in Washington, a lot in a new tune under the administration of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. That is all because of elections and a huge turnout last fall. Now, there is a huge effort underway to put in new restrictions on voting around the country. And it's led by state-level Republican governments, state, county, local Republican governments saying, oh, wait a minute here. We're going to talk about that in this hour. It's been a big week. I got a haircut. I got vaccinated. I'm very excited about that for COVID-19. Just one shot. Lucky for me to get it. Kind of a miracle, but it happened and I'm thrilled about it. Hope you get yours soon too. I want to read you a friend of ours, Ari Berman, writing in Mother Jones Era. Here's how he describes what's going on. It's kind of incredible. It says, after record turnout in 2020, Republican-controlled states appear to be in a race to the bottom to see who can pass the most egregious new barriers to voting. According to new analysis by the Brennan Center for Justice, 253 bills, 253 to restrict voting access have been introduced in 43 states already this year, and it's only February. Georgia is ground zero for the GOP's escalating war on voting. They got a bunch of new laws going on there. New law would make Georgia one of the most restrictive states in the country for mail voting. And you know, of course, Georgia was the key state where a runoff election for the U.S. Senate, two races there, flipped those seats and made it a 50-50 tie in the Senate. Kamala Harris as vice president, the tiebreaker. They're saying Georgia Republicans wrote almost every aspect of their state's already stringent voting laws and for many years promoted mail voting, specifically exempting mail ballots from voter ID requirements because they didn't want their own voters who are older and more rural to be disenfranchised. They abruptly had a change of heart in November when more Democrats than Republicans voted for the first time. There's the key. There's why so much of this is happening. And it's not just there. Iowa, new bills. Florida, new bills. All over the country, there's a huge push on to tighten up voting. Voter suppression is the phrase that's hung on this all over the place. Republicans don't like it. They say no. They're saying we're acting on Donald Trump's assertion, often called the big lie, that there were voting irregularities all over the country. Again and again, the courts have said, no, we don't see evidence of that. But Donald Trump has stuck with it. The GOP is sticking with it. And many, many states are looking to act on it right now. We're going to dive in on this because there's action coming very soon in Congress, one way or another, up or down, on what moves forward here and whether there's oversight of all these moves at the state level to tighten up, to bring in new restrictions on voting. Amanda Littman is with us today. She is kind of incredible. One of these, 30 under 30, 40 under 40 people who are really making things happen. She is co-founder and executive director of a group called, it's a political action committee called Run for Something. And they have been pushing, I think they were founded on the day Donald Trump was inaugurated, been pushing for young Americans all over the country to get involved at the state and local level, to run for office. They've recruited more than 15,000 young people to vote, to run for office around the country. Through them, they're backing specifically behind more than 1,000 of them and have hundreds now in state and local office through those efforts. Amanda was there at the beginning. Whatever club you're in, whatever vein of politics you support, this is somebody who gets stuff done. She ran the email for Hillary Clinton in 2016, not those emails, she hastens to add, but that was a huge part of the Clinton campaign. It raised $330 million there, then turned to look at building a bench at the state and local level for Democrats. That's who she supports. She's watching what's going on right now with Republican efforts around the country to tighten up restrictions on voting. And this is what caught our attention. She wrote this last week: kill the filibuster and pass H.R. 1 and the new Voting Rights Act, and we'll talk about all of that, or democracy is finished. It really is that clear cut. Let's see if we can bring her in. Amanda Littman, she's a powerhouse, and we're really happy to have her with us today. Amanda, hi, are you there? Hello, Amanda, listening for you.
Hi, how are you?
Hi.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, hear you just fine now. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Of course, happy to be here.
So you've been tweeting. Of course, that's the presidential way and every way these days. Not so much with Joe Biden, but under Trump, saying that it's all on the line right now with votes that may begin to come up as early as next week. And we want to talk with you about how you see this. We understand that Republicans are upset that they lost the Senate, that they lost the White House, that the Democrats, in effect, have all of those now, though it's a very close thing, especially in the Senate. But we've got 253 laws now up for consideration in states around the country. We have Ari Berman writing here, 43 states, and that's already just this year. It's kind of incredible. You work with candidates at the local level all over the country. So we want to hear from you exactly how this plays out. If these new restrictions go into effect, what that means for real races, real candidates around the country. But you put it in really dire terms here. Kill the filibuster. We'll talk about that. Pass HR 1. We'll talk about that. And the new Voting Rights Act, or democracy is finished. What's leading you, Amanda, to put things in such world-ending terms right now?
Well, I think it's really important to call the stakes out for what they are. The Republican Party, especially at the state level where they have power, is trying to encode that power into the law. They are trying to rig the system so that no matter what is more popular, no matter what campaigns we're doing, they win elections by default. They're trying to limit the number of people who can vote to only be Republican voters. It is a lot like what they've been doing over the last decade, but in light of the 2020 election, they realized that there is no limit to the amount of voter suppression they need in order to win. And I think it's really scary because it's in a lot of these states, there isn't much Democrats can do. A lot of these states in Georgia, just earlier this week, we were talking with one of our alumni who's a member of the Georgia state legislature, and you're asking what can folks do? And, call your state legislator, call your member of Congress, but ultimately Republicans have power in the state House and state Senate, and there's a Republican governor who will sign these bills into law. The answer has to be on the federal level.
That goes right to your mission at Run for Something. She's also author of the book, Don't Just March, Run for Something. It's kind of a field guide to running for office. You want to change that balance of party power at the local and state level, but that is a long, long way from happening at this point. So when you say Democrats can't stop it, it's because Republicans run these legislatures in so many states.
It's because for 40 years, Republicans have put together a long-term plan to build sustainable power. They have been pretty explicit about this. They said, Haley Barbour, who was formerly the chairman of the RNC at one point, has said, we saw that the brand of the Republican Party had some potential, but there wasn't the foundation there. So they invested in winning cities and school boards and county government, even in blue states, knowing that if they laid the groundwork over time, they could build it back up when combined with a national brand. So they did. They started winning these local elections, knowing that if they did so, they could then hold power. And that really culminated around the 2010 election. After about 20, 25 years of doing this work, in the 2010 election, they realized ahead of redistricting that if they won about 110 state legislative seats, they invested about $35 million, they could meaningfully control what Congress looked like for the next decade by controlling the process around redrawing maps. They weren't secret about it. They weren't shy. Karl Rove wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal and said, here's what we're going to do. They did it. And accordingly, were able to redraw the maps such that they then controlled Congress for the subsequent decade, more or less.
Are we on the verge of that happening again right now for the next decade?
It's really scary. I'll say it's really scary. We are still waiting to see, when the census numbers come out later this year or even early into next, depending on what happens here, there is a pretty good chance they will be able to draw themselves back into power. Things are definitely a little better now than they are after 2010, thanks to having flipped a couple of state legislatures, thanks to independent redistricting commissions and governors' races. And I know there's really good people doing some legal fights here, but it's going to be really tough. And I think it's one of the many reasons why it is so important in the first 2 years of President Biden's term to get shit done. I hope it's okay that I curse to get shit done, because there is a better than not chance that we lose control of the House in 2022, unless we passed the Voting Rights Act, the new Voting Rights Act, and the John Lewis HR 1 Act, which will help for the people, which will help make sure that people can actually vote and that these elections are fair.
We'll talk about those. I mean, the specter that you raise and that Republicans in some ways seem to acknowledge, maybe explicitly acknowledge and drive for, is a specter of minority rule in what's supposed to be the world's greatest democracy. That is sort of districts gerrymandered and locked in, and restrictions on voting that keep people locked out more or less, so that even if a party has less popular support, it actually runs the country anyway. That's kind of the definition of minority rule.
Yeah, I think it's exactly what they're trying to go for. And, we joke around on Twitter, like, well, at least they got their judges and their tax cuts. That was the point. The point was the judges and the tax cuts. The tax cuts for the donors, the judges, in order to enshrine some of these questionable laws into code. It is really scary when you think about the stakes here, because we know that progressive policies are more popular. We know that, generally speaking, Democratic candidates win when you count the popular vote. It was true in 2020. It was true in 2016. There is a growing Democratic majority in this country, and the Republicans have been able to rig the system in such a way that doesn't really matter.
It's the scary thing about it is that it means if you embrace a minority rule sort of approach and strategy, you don't have to persuade the country anymore. You just sort of, rule becomes the operative word here. You're ruling it without persuading. Republicans have had success in the past with their ideology, and this is different. This is, agree or not, we're gonna be the boss. We're gonna build it in such a way that a majority can't vote their way to power.
And I think it's worth calling out, the Republican ideology at this point is anti-democracy. Not every voter feels this way, but certainly the Republican elected officials seem to feel this way. There is no coherent ideology around the economy, around social services, around healthcare. What is the Republican alternative healthcare plan? There isn't one.
We know they didn't have a platform last year. It was
their
just
literal platform,
elect Donald Trump.
Their literal platform at the Republican National Committee was whatever Trump says is good. That is, I think, the most perfect embodiment of, there is not a coherent ideology here. The most coherent ideology they have is that it is bad when Black, brown, and young people vote. That's not a governing mandate. What that is an excuse to try and hold power. I always ask myself, hold power to what end? It really does seem to be a kind of aversion to change, aversion to progress, aversion to multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-class democracy. It is not in support of something substantial that will make people's lives better.
It's a strange and awkward thing for someone like me. I've been a journalist all my life, and you put two different platforms on the table, and I will dutifully dig into both of them and talk and write and with anyone who's interested about the merits of those platform planks. But if you put whatever one guy says out there, that's a different thing. And if you appear to give up on majority rule, that's a different thing. That requires a different kind of scrutiny and a different kind of approach journalistically. You are a political operative, unabashed. That's what you're doing. You've got to win races in order to have an impact on public policy. But if it's in a skewed system, that's tough to do. There are big bills that are on the table right now, and I wish we could look at them a little bit together. You've got, talk to them about it. You say there's three things that you say we've got to have here to save us from minority rule, maybe for a long time. HR 1, the Voting Rights Act, often called the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. This is, of course, the famous congressman who died last summer, I think he's put this on the table 5 years in a row before his death. It never got through. Maybe it would now. And then you see we've got to also take away the filibuster. And I'd like to walk through all that. I want to come to what your candidates see on the ground when they're up against obstacles that they have faced and may face more of if a lot of these state laws go through. But if there's not some federal response to this, that could be the story of 2022 and before. But take us to, if you'd be good enough, like HR 1, what is it?
So HR 1 is a really expansive bill that has already passed the House at least once that does a couple things. It prevents foreign interference in our elections. It limits the amount of money in politics. It increases election security. It sets up a structure for every state to create a nonpartisan redistricting committee, so it gets rid of gerrymandering. It mandates 15 days of early voting at least. It mandates same-day voter registration. It creates an automatic voter registration, and it facilitates a giant vote-by-mail program nationwide. And there's a lot of questions about what can actually be done here and where the levers are. But ultimately speaking, it's an incredibly popular bill. Some of the stuff in this bill, like preventing foreign interference, has supported by something like 86% of voters. The things that even are like medium popular here are still supported by a vast majority of voters. These are wildly popular. And even with Republican voters, 57% of Republican voters support the For the People Act. This is an absolutely bipartisan push that will make Congress and our federal elections, no, there's a separate conversation to be had about what it does to our state and local elections, but our federal elections better. That will go a long, long way towards mitigating some of the damage that these state legislatures are doing.
But you say bipartisan support. I mean, maybe in opinion polls, but where it matters in terms of legislation in Congress, there's definitely not bipartisan support.
Well, this is the question of how do you define bipartisanship? Do you find it by what Congress is doing or by where the American people are at? And I think it's definitely, for me, if you look at the American people, a bipartisan cross-section of the American people support this legislation. Their representatives should take their cue from them.
So that's HR 1. And of course, that means it's the first order of business. This could come up as early as next week?
That's my understanding, is that the House is going to vote on it again in this new member of Congress, new congressional session, in order to bring it up and then push it to the Senate. So that won't come to the Senate floor.
The Senate has a very similar bill already. So this, if it should happen, there's not much light between the Senate and House bills, but presumably you're going to get huge pushback from the GOP on this, because this goes precisely against the strategy that we see playing out in state legislatures around voting laws right now. Then there's the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, Voting Rights Advancement Act. Patrick Leahy is pushing this forward now, Senator out of Vermont. Talk to us about that. What did the great John Lewis want to see happen with this bill?
So the John Lewis Voting Advancement Rights Act will give the public legal tools needed to remedy acts of discrimination in elections. So it doesn't go around states, doesn't go around local voting procedures. What it does is say that voters who face racial discrimination can challenge it. It restores the pre-clearance regime that was gutted by the John Roberts Supreme Court. So things like making sure that there's public notice of voting changes, lowering the burden of obtaining a court order against problematic voting changes. It provides for neutral election observers. What it really does is it's modeled after the original Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is one of the most successful pieces of civil rights legislation in the country.
Which, of course, John Lewis fought and was bloodied for, and was the law of the land for decades until 2013, when the Supreme Court in the Shelby County case struck down this pre-clearance. And that applied to states and localities that had a history or a track record of restricting voter access unconstitutionally. And what if they were acting on things that had to be reviewed by at the federal level before it was allowed to go forward? The Supreme Court essentially took that away. It said, we don't need this anymore.
And, every reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, which I believe it was done 5 times.
5-6 times, yeah.
5-6 times, was signed into law by a Republican president. Every single reauthorization is done on a bipartisan measure, because at the very least, up until the last maybe 15 years, the Republican Party was on the level here of, we are a democracy. Things have changed wildly in the last decade, and especially in the last 5 years, and that's no longer the case. But we need this in order to ensure that there's a way to make sure that Black and brown communities are able to show up at the polls.
Now, the Republican critique of this, and it's not hard to find, is sort of 2 layers to it. The first is that the claim that there's voter restriction, voter suppression, they call a liberal myth. No, this is not happening, is a Republican message. and that if you come in with legislation like H.R. 1, legislation like the John Lewis Act, this is the federal government putting its foot on the neck of state and local governments in the way they, in their wisdom, think elections ought to be handled. What about each of those? A, it's a myth. B, this is federal overreach.
Tell the Georgia voters who stood in line for 12 hours that it's a myth. Tell the Wisconsin voters who could only go find one polling place in their county, or down in Texas where there was one polling place for a county the size of Rhode Island during early vote. This is not a myth for those voters, and this is not a myth for millions of voters across the country who had to really climb through, I imagine like the Indiana Jones, sort of like the dropping pillars of the cavern in order to get their way to the polls. It is shocking to me that they try and pretend this isn't the case, especially when they quite pointedly then advocate for laws that they say will make it harder for the wrong kind of people to vote. Like, they are the ones perpetuating this.
I mean, you've got this in Georgia, you now have measures that would prohibit what they call line warming by nonpartisan groups. Now that sounds, what, line warming? What? That sounds a little, maybe it's suspicious, but what is it? That is activities like distributing water in hot weather when people are standing in line to vote, or blankets for people standing in the freezing cold. And of course, in the last couple of years, we've seen many examples where people had to stand in line for a long, long time to vote, and it would outlaw bringing them any water or warmth as they did that. It's kind of wild. What about the federal overreach piece of this? Get out of our faces, get out of our states' rights. We know how to handle our own elections. Thank you.
I think any member of Congress who said that, any Republican member of Congress who said that, would have to grapple with the reality that when the states have trampled over people's lives, have done things that have screwed over people, it is the federal government's responsibility and precedent to intervene. That is what the role of the federal government is, to ensure that one of the many roles of the federal government is to ensure that when states' laws are being carried over in a way that is unfair or unjust, that there's a remedy for that. I think it's telling that a number of the United States senators who are currently serving voted to reauthorize the 2006 Voting Rights Act because they agreed that it was important, including some of the worst offenders. Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell both voted to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act in 2006. What has changed since then that we no longer need this?
What's the answer to that?
Nothing. It's gotten worse. The answer they have is nothing. The reality is that voter suppression has only gotten worse, and at the behest of the Republican Party.
I mean, my fear is that something has changed, and the thing that's changed is that the GOP has come to identify itself more and more as a party of fearful white voters. Mm-hmm. And they see the demographics of the country changing. And after, of course, not so many years ago, there was a big internal discussion about how they needed to urgently open the party more to a diverse America that is a fact in this century. Maybe they've given up on that. And this is the only way they can see to, for some period of years, protect their majorities when they can win them, which seems like a kind of giving up on democracy itself. And it's scary when a major party does that. Am I off base with that analysis?
No, I think you're right. And the thing I think about a lot is sort of the impact. We talk a lot about the impact of Fox News on Republican voters. A lot of these Republican elected officials are also Fox News viewers, and that's where they're consuming their news. There is an ecosystem here that is ginning up fear, that is ginning up anxiety. It's very grounded in a sort of racial lens. And when you have a party that primarily needs to win and almost exclusively needs to win white voters, you try and play off of that, which is it's like, we're not playing on the level here. We don't have a good faith opponent and a good faith partner in governing anymore. It's really sad. It's really sad.
Take us into the wool of this, because that's where you work. You recruit people to run at state level, at local level, state assemblies, local school boards. Does this play out there as well? Does it play out in those races? Do you see your candidates coming up against voter suppression in a way that makes it harder for them to win or discourages them from running in the first place, Amanda?
We do. We see a lot of candidates trying to run, especially on the state legislative level, in districts that have already been gerrymandered. We talk about gerrymandering in Congress, but it's also happening in about a third of the country in these state capitals. That's one of the reasons, especially like in a state like Wisconsin, where Democrats have won the popular vote. We have a Democratic governor over and over again, yet Republicans still control the state house and state senate. They have redrawn those districts to the point where it is hard for Democrats to even consider jumping in the game in the first place. Similarly happening in Texas. It's scary for them because the partisanship of a district will start out being plus 10 or plus 12 Republican, and no one wants to be a sacrificial lamb. So I do think it gets in the way for a lot of them. It also, there's some real barriers to entry around campaign finance. There's really complicated rules about registering to vote and about sending people ballots, especially during COVID, about vote by mail and the changing laws and the changing deadlines. And even things like language access and accessibility to the polls as folks with disabilities. For a lot of our candidates, the one that Run for Something works with, they're trying to reach voters who don't usually get reached by the political system, by the top of the ticket, because they're trying to really have one-on-one conversations. And those are folks for whom simply the act of voting for the first time can be really scary when you don't even factor in all of the complications that Republican leaders have put ahead of them.
So I guess we need to stipulate here, congressional districts, we've seen how they're can be wildly gerrymandered. You're saying state assembly districts will be different because it's a different map. There's smaller districts, I guess. And there too, you've got the same thing going on?
You do in many states. The process for drawing state legislative maps varies from place to place as much as it does congressional maps. But in many of these states over the last decade, it is quite literally the state legislators deciding who they want their voters to be. It is a state assemblyman or assemblywoman sketching out which neighborhoods they want to have in their district for the next decade. It is as rigged as it can be in some of these states.
I always wonder why, when you draw gerrymandered districts in that way, whether congressional or state assembly, state legislature, if you draw something that's very, very Republican, why doesn't that create an equal and opposite district that's very, very Democratic leaning?
Well, it varies from place to place, but they do have this process they call crack and pack, where you might crack a Republican, either you will pack a bunch of Democratic voters into one district and then split the rest of the Republican community into three, so ultimately giving yourself like a 3-to-1 ratio, or you will dilute the power of Democratic voters by creating, maybe 4 Republican districts, each of which have some Democratic voters in them, but not enough to create the majority.
So what's it like when you go out to recruit, run for something in your organization? I mean, you're out there all the time saying, come on, let's change this from the ground up. And it's a big welcome mat that you put out. And there's a lot of fever and enthusiasm around bringing our nation's politics up to speed with our nation, not leaving our politics in the past. I think anybody who's got an ounce of optimism wants to keep it working, wants to make it work in a good way and trust in the people to vote for what's good for the people. I mean, that's the whole idea.
Yeah.
What's the enthusiasm level that you find out there when you reach out and say, come on, people, get in here, run for office? Is there enthusiasm for that, or is there cynicism around that? What's the temperature, Amanda?
It is remarkable how optimistic people are. Since Run for Something launched a little over 4 years ago, and we've identified nearly 75,000 young people all across the country who've told us they want to run. More than 10,000 of them have signed up since election 2020. January 2021 was our best recruitment month yet, which is beyond my wildest dreams, but also an indication that this was not about Trump. It's never about Trump. It's about the party that he's building. It's about the legacy that he's left. And it is about a wave of young people, predominantly young people of color, predominantly young women, predominantly young LGBTQ folks, who are saying this is not what my democracy looks like. And I will not tolerate it happening without a fight, which is really beautiful.
So how does that, when they raise their hand and say, I'm interested, describe the process. What do you tell them? How do you communicate with them? What's the message that you're giving them? What's the distance from saying, I'm interested to, yes, my hat's in the ring?
So every person who signs up at runforwhat.net to tell us they're interested in running for office then gets invited to a conference call. On that call, which we do weekly, we talk through the basics of how to run for office, the standard questions that everyone has. They then have a one-on-one with one of our volunteers. And our volunteers, at least for Run for Something, are looking for 4 basic things. Is this person 40 years old or younger? Because we mostly work with young people.
Okay.
Is this person interested in running for local office? We don't do Congress, we don't do Senate, we don't do governors. We do state house and Senate, school board, library board, water board, county clerk, DA, local.
Okay.
Is this person progressive or a Democrat? We are looking for folks who share our values, but we know that a Democrat in New York is a little different than a Democrat in Louisiana or Alaska. And then finally, is this person a hell yeah kind of person? When our volunteer talks to them, do they get excited about the conversation?
Yeah.
From there, every person in our pipeline has access to a whole bunch of resources ranging from guides on how to get on the ballot to what to do once you're on the ballot, how to write a campaign plan, what to do when you get the voter file, how to run ads, how to develop a message, the whole litany.
Is it interesting for them to run for local office, the kind of really local stuff you're talking about? Or is that that sounds like a headache, sitting in some Zoom meeting or some city hall back room on a Thursday night when I'd rather be watching Netflix?
I'll say the people we work with are very special angels. They're all opting into local government, but we have found that when you ask people, what's the problem you care about solving? And then what's the office that will give you a platform to solve it?
Yeah.
The answer is almost always something much smaller and much more important than you would think. When you think about climate change, it's actually often a city council or municipal question of building codes and recycling programs and energy delivery. When you think about criminal justice reform, that's a DA or a county board conversation. When you're thinking about even immigrants' rights, cities and counties can decide whether or not to be sanctuary cities. There's a lot of ways in which on the really big issues, you can make meaningful, fast, direct progress on the local level. And on a really practical sense, it's a place where a 22-year-old or a 31-year-old or a new parent or someone with also a full-time job can actually run and win and serve.
What's the national picture on those local level positions, elected positions, and state level positions now? We've heard for a long time Republicans have been dominant, but how dominant?
There's not really great numbers on this. What I will say is that we know that Republicans control about 2/3 of all state legislators, although Democrats have won back quite a few over the last decade. We have worked with, Run for Something has now endorsed about 1,500 candidates in our 4 years. About 75 to 100 of them, depending on how you measure, are the first Democrat to run in their race in at least 2 cycles, often more. That should give you a sense of how many places we are just leaving uncontested. And in any given year, anywhere from 35% of state legislative races to 70% of local elections are going uncontested, meaning it's only one candidate running. That's not democracy. That's not voters having a choice.
What percentage of those uncontested districts are Republican versus Democrat? Some of those are Democratic districts.
At least on the state legislative level, it bounces back and forth. But over the last couple cycles, it has been more Democrats running uncontested than Republicans. But that was not true in the decade prior.
Okay, so that can cut both ways. When you mention the kind of people putting their hand up or that you're reaching out to, you're talking about people of color, you're talking about women, young people, great. Do you see I'm just curious, do you have young white candidates coming to you as well? Or are you writing them off because that's the GOP? I can't imagine that, but what's there's still a lot of white voters in this country too. What about that sector?
Run for Something has worked with, as I said, about 1,500 endorsed candidates in 4 years. About half have been people of color, about half have been white. So we're still working with a really diverse group of folks, and it's a little more reflective than the American people. But we're making sure that the candidates we're working with are representative of the communities they're trying to run in. So like in my old neighborhood in Brooklyn, where I used to live in a Caribbean neighborhood, it would have been a little unusual for a white guy to run for office there. Whereas maybe the neighborhood I live in now, it would make more sense.
Yeah. And what about the Republican infrastructure that you find yourself competing with? Is it better organized, better financed? comparable? What's that look like?
So the best thing that we know about, to our knowledge, is an organization called the Leadership Institute. It is about 30 years old. They have a $35 million a year annual budget. They're a 501c3, and they work to recruit and support conservative operatives, activists, and candidates. Basically, every Republican official you hear about, talk to, who's come up in the last 20 years, has gone through their program or hired someone through their program. It's primarily funded, I believe, by the Koch brothers.
And how does that compare with your funding, your operation?
Our annual budget this year is about 3.2 million, so not 35.
10%. But you must not be the only left-leaning outfit that's trying to recruit candidates, or are you at that level?
We are one of the few that works at a national scale on the local level exclusively with young people. You know, there's certainly organizations, and we partner with many organizations like Emily's List and Emerge America and Collective PAC and Higher Heights and the DLCC. But we're one of the few that does this at the scale that we're currently at.
You were doing national work. You were on Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016. You were running that gigantic email operation, raised $300+ million. What got you to turn to the local? Were you like given it, here's soldier, here's your duty, go run the local thing? Or was that your choice? How'd that happen?
No, it was my choice. After Election Day in 2016, I was devastated, as you can imagine. About a week later, I got a Facebook message from somebody I went to college with. I went to Northwestern in Chicago. He sent me a Facebook message. Hey, Amanda, I'm a public school teacher here in Chicago. They keep cutting our budgets. If Trump can be president, it seems like anybody can do this. What do I do if I want to run for office and fight for my classrooms? And I didn't have an answer for him because at the time, if you were young and newly excited about this space, but didn't really know like the mechanics, there wasn't somewhere you could go that would be guaranteed to answer your call. And the more that I thought about that, the more that I realized that was a symptom of some really serious problems in the way that the Democratic Party had invested over the last 20 years. And in particular, a weak and not diverse bench of talent for the future, and a total lack of focus on local elections and local government. And I was certainly part of that problem as a junior staffer, although reflective of it, if not leading to it. I sent an email to a whole bunch of friends saying, what if we create an organization to solve this problem? One of whom became my co-founder, Ross Morales-Repetto, who's worked in campaigns for about 15 years. And we wrote a plan and we built a website, and then we launched it on Inauguration Day, morning of. We thought it would be so small. We thought we'd have a side hobby. Instead, we had 1,000 people sign up in the first week, which told us that there was an interest in doing this. And now we're at a point where 1,000 people in a week is basically the norm. So it's pretty cool.
Amazing. What's the flavor of the people coming in? Democrats, there's quite a span. Joe Biden was traditionally a quite centrist Democrat. Hillary Clinton, seen as, neoliberal and much reviled because of that by more progressive parts of the Democratic Party. What's the flavor of the Democrats that are coming through your portal, Amanda?
They're generally reflective of the communities that they're in. We ask every candidate we work with to align with some value statements. So pro-choice, pro-tolerance, pro-equality, pro-immigrants' rights, pro-criminal justice reform, like affirming climate change is real and we have a responsibility to do something. But they really span the entire breadth of the party, certainly leaning a little more progressive, by nature of the generational sort of divide in the Democratic Party. But my favorite thing about the candidates we work with is that the only thing they all share is a willingness to do the work and a passion for solving problems. And in fact, like one of the coolest things we've found over the last couple of years is that the younger the candidate is, the more likely they are to say a desire to make change is the reason that they're running for office. It is, I think, reflective really well of the younger generations that are coming up.
I mean, I get excited by the idea of having our country's politics align with our country's people. We got a beautiful people, and we need to make changes. Just look at climate for starters. Look at access to political life, which is what we're talking about right here. Gesundheit, bless you. Resisting that seems to me to be it bums me out. Let's embrace what's vital and what's real and what our country is emerging as. Well, it's always emerging, and let's stay with that. But that's not the way things have moved in many states. And now when you look at H.R. 1, which would come up as early as next week, when you look at the John Lewis Act, both of these, when they get to the Senate, they'll run into the filibuster. Now, your kind of, desperate tweet, which caught my eye, kill the filibuster and pass H.R. 1 and the new Voting Rights Act, or democracy is finished. It really is that clear cut. That was you just in the last couple of days. Let's look at the filibuster piece of that. Now, of course, that's what has emerged as over time. It's not in the Constitution, nothing to do with that, but just as a Senate rule. And these days, if there's any controversy whatsoever about a bill, you've got to have 60 votes to get past that filibuster hurdle. You say end it. It's been called the nuclear option for years, in part because people thought if we end it and then lose the majority, the other party will turn around and do whatever they please if they've got 50 votes plus the VP, and we'll be in trouble. You say, what? Never mind, we've got to do it anyway? Talk about it.
I think that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, especially for Democrats. The only way, the map is already tough against us. The only way that Democrats are going to be able to hold power in the midterms and beyond is if we actually deliver for people, send them our stimulus checks, get vaccines in their arms, make their roads better to drive on, make their elections free and fair, get them affordable health care, cut their student debt. We got to deliver for people. We have to give them something to vote for. If not only because not only the Republican Party has a base that's built in and basically shows up year in, year out. Democratic voters, we need a little drive, need a little push. And that push can be a carrot or it can be a stick. Trump was a stick for a long time, but moving forward, we need to give people carrots. I think it is self-fulfilling, tautological bullshit to say, if we get rid of the filibuster and then Republicans win, what will they do with it? If we get rid of the filibuster, it is possible we can make sure Republicans don't win. But if we don't, it is almost guaranteed. It's almost guaranteed, especially with those voter suppression that's occurring on the state level. If we don't get rid of the filibuster and pass these kinds of voting right reforms, there is no clear path to a Democrat ever controlling power again. And the Republican Party is setting themselves up so that their state legislatures could refuse to certify elections that Democrats win. It is not really hyperbolic to say that if we do not kill the filibuster and then pass these voting rights reforms, a Democrat will never be able to win a federal office again or a presidency again. And that Democrats who do will have the elections overturned by Republican state legislatures who refuse to seat them.
So you're really looking at the kind of January 6th phenomena where you had in the House and the Senate elected representatives ready to throw out the Electoral College votes that had been certified and brought to Washington and supported by an angry mob outside and then inside, of course, Congress. But that's your fear is that it will become as heavy-handed as that. I mean, we were within a whisker of I don't know what on January 6th anyway. But you really see that as can you imagine the Democratic, and I mean that with a small d, the vitality of American democracy being locked in a box like that? Could that really happen?
That's what they were trying to do. They were trying to throw out the electoral votes of Arizona, of Pennsylvania, of Georgia. They were trying to say those votes didn't count because they were cast primarily by Black and brown people. And I have no question that a Republican Party in which, 73 members of the House voted to, a majority of the House Republican Conference and a large number of the Senate Republican Conference voted to overturn the results of the 2020 election, in which more than 500 elected Republican state legislators tried to perpetuate this lie, tried to vote themselves, or encourage people to show up. And 57 Republican state and local elected officials were there in DC on that day. Were there. They were there.
You mean in the mob that came in?
In the mob. They went to the rally. Many of them went on to the Capitol. They were at Trump's rally that day where he spoke and then said, storm the Capitol, and off they went. This is what their party is. Trumpism was not an anomaly. Trump was not a symptom. Trump is the almost at this point inevitable byproduct of a party that no longer believes in democracy. I don't think every Republican voter feels this way. In fact, I don't think most Republican voters feel this way about democracy when framed in these terms. But right now, a majority of them believe the election was stolen because that's what their elected officials and leaders are telling them. And that's a very scary place for democracy to be. Democrats in the Senate have a chance to kill the filibuster and pass these laws in order to unrig our elections and at least level the playing field. Doesn't solve every problem, doesn't get rid of disinformation, doesn't change the fact that we're operating in two separate realms of reality. But we can fix this. Why wouldn't you take the chance and fix it when you have the power and the majority that, at least I know, we have worked so hard for over the last 4 years and 8 years and decades?
This is some serious shit right here, because you know as well as I do that right now, just by head count, they don't have the votes in the Senate to kill the filibuster. If you don't have Joe Manchin, West Virginia, if you don't have Kirsten Sinema, Arizona, I don't know about John Tester, Montana, and if you don't have Republicans to replace them, I don't know who they would be. You can't kill it. You're savvy. I mean, you're plugged in. Do you see the votes out there to kill the filibuster? Because you're describing a pretty dystopian future for American democracy if it is not killed.
You know, and I don't even know if what I'm describing is as bad as it could get, which is the scary part. You know, I think we're going to see what happens. The House will pass the legislation. They'll take it to the Senate, and then there will be pressure. And I think it's going to be.
You mean the voting rights legislation, HR1,
yes,
voting
so like
rights
HR1,
Act on Lewis?
Yeah.
Okay, so that'll show up. Is that the sequence you expect? That it'll show up, it will meet resistance, and then somehow the move is made to kill the filibuster? Is that the sequence you imagine?
I think it's a really hard argument to make by Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin that this is the line they're going to draw. And I hope that people who live in their state, that Arizonans and Montanans and West Virginians, can put pressure on their elected officials to do so. It's going to be tough. It's also going to require President Biden putting pressure on them. It's going to require Vice President Kamala Harris putting pressure on them. It's going to require Chuck Schumer putting pressure on them. It is going to require. What's
pressure? You're plugged in. What does Joe Manchin want, or what's he afraid of? One of those two things that would turn his vote. Or what about Kirsten Sinema?
Well, I think that's a question for them to answer, is what would it take? You know, I think a big part of this is either fear of losing their election, fear of losing money for funding for their election, or some other kind of reward. I tend to like carrots over sticks, but what new building would we like to, what military base should we open in West Virginia or Arizona? What new government initiative should be based in these places? How can we bring more jobs and more money to these folks? Do I think that's the only answer? No, but I will admit it is something when I think about too hard, I get very desolate. It makes me very sad because I don't know if there's a clear path. But I want to say, well, that doesn't mean we should keep fighting. That doesn't mean that people who live in these states shouldn't keep calling and haranguing their elected officials to end the filibuster. It's going to be extremely hard. I don't want to bullshit people. It's going to be extremely hard.
And the things that hang on this, you think about democracy, that's a pretty big one.
Yeah.
The climate and what happens to the environment that we and our kids and grandkids and right on down have to live in. And we don't have a lot of time here. People are saying that if this doesn't go through, free and fair elections, you've written, you know, are doomed. Well, okay, maybe not forever, but even if it's just a decade, even if it's until the next census somehow, those are critical 10 years for lots of things, for democracy, for battling climate change. Lose that decade and you've lost a lot. I hate to even go there, but I saw you roll your eyes and say it could be even worse. What's the real dystopia you fear if we don't get this breakthrough?
Oh, I don't like to think about it too much, I'll admit, but you know, I think there's a world in which maybe some states decide not to hold elections anymore. And maybe the voting registration rules get so onerous and so egregious that ultimately you have a primarily white electorate or primarily Republican electorate who's able to show up and vote.
Some kind of voting apartheid.
Yeah. And what happens when you have an election with a national election with 30% turnout because that's the only folks who are eligible? what happens when they decide? I mean, there was a lot of conversation of like, well, Trump could cancel the election. What happens if you get a guy it's probably a guy with the ideology of Trump, but a little bit more competency? It's a scary thought.
I mean, for my generation, that seems unimaginable that what you're describing there could be the United States of America. I mean, it sounds like a cliche, but it's not. That, lots and lots of people have fought and struggled and died from the very beginning to have the democracy that we have scratched out here, that we have been able to, imperfect as it is, incomplete as it is, that we have been able to build. It's hard to imagine that going so dramatically off the rails. And yet, on January 6th, a vista was opened up, and before, that looked pretty damn scary. It's a little unnerving for me to hear your level of sort of real fear about that, working as close to the grassroots of democracy as you do. And yet I hear it, Amanda.
It is. It's very scary. And I think it's one of the reasons why I'm so committed to this work on the local level is, I, as a sort of cynical optimist, is how I like to describe it. I am deeply hopeful about the future of this country. I really am, because I've seen what good leadership can do. I have seen and worked with some of the most amazing young leaders who have expanded healthcare to hundreds of thousands of Virginians and protected trans inmates in Minneapolis and gotten police officers out of schools in Denver and have really revolutionized what life can look like in their communities and have changed what leadership looks like. And I do not believe that the Republican elected officials we currently have are operating in good faith. I do not believe they're on the level. I do not believe they are good partners in governing. And I really hope that there are young Republican leaders coming up who have some kind of core sense of ownership of this democratic process, small d democratic process, and who really believe that there is an ideology they can further, whether or not I agree with that ideology, but that they have one that consists of, what kind of how much should we pay teachers? Not whether we should be paying them at all. That kind of question. I wish that we had a in good faith opposing party. Right now,
what do you say to win them over? Let's say, some of these fears are really sort of deep base kind of fears, Pavlovian, it's going to flip from, maybe it's been white supremacist. The next thing you know, it's going to be brown supremacist, and, white people will be perpetually the underdog. You're working with all kinds of candidates, many of color. Speak to that white voter who's afraid of a future. You could say, well, why even speak to it? Why even give that, that view respect? Well, because saving democracy may depend on bringing a bunch of those people over, persuading them that it's going to be all right.
Well, there's a lot of folks who would disagree with that premise that saving democracy counts on them. If can you expand the electorate to include the young people and the folks of color who are not voting in the first place? But if you grant the premise, which I'll allow, I think there's a place.
Even if you don't like that way of framing it, it's going to be a much better country if we've got everybody in, instead of, people who are fearful and angry and with shotguns at the door all the time. We'd like to paint a picture of a country where all of America is engaged and welcome and heard, all of it. And I don't mean that as all lives matter versus Black Lives Matter. I just mean let's have a healthy, full democracy where we drive out the fear. Is there something in what you hear from young candidates that you're putting up for office that should give long-term peace of mind to white voters who are fearful right now, or not?
I think that there's a couple components here. One is that the messenger really matters. It needs to be somebody they trust. It needs to be somebody who they feel has their best interests at heart. It needs to be someone who can come from a place of empathy. It's one of the reasons why I think the local candidates that we work with are often the best messengers to these voters, because they're like one of us. It's one of us. It's someone who, like, you see at the grocery store, you go to church with, you go to synagogue with, that kind of thing. And I think often grounding it in those kinds of tangible, practical things. It's like, you may not like the Democrat you see on TV. You might not like the one that Fox News is showing you, but you know me. You trust me. You have seen what I will do for our schools. You've seen what I will do for our streets and our businesses. And you and I can agree, even if we don't necessarily agree on like the mechanics of how we should give everyone healthcare. Isn't it crazy how expensive your insulin is?
Hell yes.
Isn't it like, yeah, isn't it batshit that you've lost your job and it's really hard for you to get unemployment insurance right now? You know, there's some real touchstones to people's lives when you start talking about it, not as a policy position or as a partisan position, but as a way of experiencing these policy positions that makes it remove from the thing they read in the news and become, you know, personal. And so I have found, and our candidates have found, that when they have those conversations with folks around, and especially on the local level, it's much easier because the issues that you're talking about tend to be more direct. You can sort of supersede that sense of identity as a Republican or as a white person or as a, you know, a patriot, and appeal to something bigger, of a neighbor, a friend, a person of faith, a parent. And I think there's some really interesting neurological studies here that I've seen about how the only way to really combat that cognitive dissonance of, you know, the most interesting one I saw was looking at the pictures of the inauguration of like Sean Spicer saying it's the most popular inauguration ever. And like, clearly that's not true. The way that you supersede that kind of cognitive dissonance is by appealing to a higher sense of identity, is by, you know, as Americans, we can agree that you shouldn't go broke to pay for your kid's appendix surgery. As Americans, we can agree on that. And when you start to tie it together like that, I think there's a path forward, but it's so hard. It's so hard.
Flip it around, because we've got the threat, we've got the problem, we've got the fear. Let's say that, I don't know, Joe Biden somehow and Kamala Harris bring in Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema and John Testa, and they sit them down and they put cards on the table that are, they make them an offer they can't refuse. Okay. And let's say the filibuster ends and these voting rights pieces of federal legislation pass, right? And it'll be by one vote in the Senate, most likely, if it were, but Kamala Harris makes the vote, and there they are. What's the upside? What's the other path? If that should happen, what's possible? What does that vista look like, Amanda?
I think it's so beautiful. I think there's some really interesting research that shows that when you get rid of the filibuster and you stop making the barrier 60 votes, you're actually more likely to get bipartisan legislation, because no one person you don't need 10 Republicans. You maybe need one or two. And if something's guaranteed to win, then a Republican elected official is going to want to have a say in what it looks like. So you might actually get bills that start passing with 53, 54, 55, which would be good. But I think there's so much opportunity for things like really ambitious climate legislation, for things like student debt, for reforming our immigration system to make it more humane, for criminal justice reform, for things like legalizing marijuana, which could really expand revenue streams for one, and also bring some equity to our criminal justice system for two. There's opportunities for massive infrastructure investment, for rural broadband, for things like basically eliminating child poverty, which is still a huge problem and one that federal legislation could tackle. And that doesn't even get into what you might say are some of the smaller things, but maybe even not small. I can't believe I didn't say codifying a woman's right to choose into the American law, you know, codifying Roe v. Wade, protecting LGBTQ folks, you know, as they're doing in the House with the Equality Act. There's just like so much opportunity. And when you get rid of the filibuster and you expand the possibility for bipartisanship, it can actually be really incredible. And we know this because we see it happen in cities and counties and even in some state legislatures. I find the Nebraska State Senate to actually be deeply fascinating. The Nebraska State Senate is a unicameral legislature and everybody is nonpartisan. So while there's certainly some like partisan identification within it, you know, there's caucusing, they really do work hand in hand and pass some really interesting bipartisan stuff. You know, for example, Just last year, the Nebraska State Senate passed legislation to pay college athletes.
Who
Fascinating.
many people have seen as exploited for many, many years.
Totally
Colleges make
exploited.
tons of money, and there they are with nothing.
And I think that, like, is that a perfect example? No, but it is the kind of thing where you forget that government can have a role that really makes people's lives better until you see it work.
Well, it's amazing to live at a time, at a moment where all of these stakes that we're talking about, they are on the table right in front of us, and the votes that are going to determine one way or another are just days away. I mean, it's so vivid, it's so present, it's so right in front of our faces right now. It's amazing.
Yeah, there's an old Jewish curse of "May you live in interesting times." I
Jewish,
cannot wait.
Chinese, it's everybody's okay.
Can
Here
we live?
Whatever it is.
I aspire to less interesting times, but for now, I'll take this.
Yeah. Hey, I also saw on your Twitter you like dog smiles. I love that. You got a lot of pictures of smiling dogs.
I did. I did not realize that would be a hot take. It's something my fiance and I argue about a lot whenever I look at our dog and say, she's smiling. He Googles it and shows me dogs don't smile. So
is your dog Sadie? Did I see that in your feed?
she is. She's asleep in our bed right now.
That was my dog for
Sadie.
many years. Sadie was my yellow lab for many years. Sadie Bell.
Sadie dogs are good dogs.
Sadie dogs are good dogs. And we take our comforts where we find them. If we don't get, I don't know if a dog smile will make up for what happens here on the political front, but you got to take comfort where you can find it.
Find the joy.
Find the joy. Amanda Littman with Run for Something. We applaud you for the way you've really jumped in and made participating in our democracy that we still value, I do anyway, and a whole lot of people, and see as the way forward, the way of joy and hopefully a more perfect union. We really admire the way you've jumped in and worked on it. And we're grateful to you for sharing your perspective with us here today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you. Talk again soon.
Will do.
Bye.
Bye.
Amanda Littman with Run for Something. Listeners, thank you very much for being with us today. There's a lot on the line here. We all see it. And let's make the best of it. I mean, this is the one democracy we've got. And you can see democracy is not exactly on a thriving path around the world. We've got to do our best to hold up that light, hold up that torch so that others see that opportunity, that possibility. And we've got to make it better because we know how imperfect it's been. We can do it. Let's do it together. Thanks for joining us on Ashbrook Live.